Me, male 43, and my ex-wife divorced 6 years ago. The reason was her refusing to move with me out of the country and leave her folks and the town she grew up in. She was a very generous, kind-hearted woman, and our separation never affected the mutual respect we had for each other. I work in construction. I left the country and met my now wife and stepdaughter, who's 18. She lives with her mother. My relationship with her is based on respect, although we're not that close. Anyways, my ex-wife got sick in the last couple of years. I stayed in contact to check in on her since I live in another country. My wife is okay with that since she knows my ex and I knew each other since childhood. My stepdaughter, however, would make comments about her, although she never met her. She'd ask me inappropriate questions, compare her mom to my ex, and ask if I ever thought about going back to the country and getting romantically involved with my ex again. I snapped and told her to stop, and that was it. I recently was able to get an apartment that I was planning on renting out, but my wife said it'd be great if I let my stepdaughter move into the apartment as her 18th birthday gift. Said she'd be very grateful for the support, and I agreed, thinking my stepdaughter is more deserving than others. She was happy when she knew. She saw it and was excited to move next month. Last week I received the worst news of my life. My ex-wife passed away. My stepdaughter came into the room and saw me sitting on the floor. She asked, and I told her my ex-wife passed away. She looked at me, then smirked and said, "Ding dong, which is finally dead." I was stunned. I yelled at her, telling her to get out. I told my wife what happened and that I'm taking back the keys to the apartment from my stepdaughter after the disrespect she showed to a woman she never even met. My wife argued that she was joking. I asked if this was a good time for her jokes, seeing me like this and acting insensitive. She didn't respect the woman I loved and grew up with for years. My wife called me harsh and that she's just a kid, but I refused to discuss it, and now they're claiming I'm being cruel and shouldn't go back after promising. Not the a-hole. Don't bite the hand that feeds. Play stupid games, get stupid prizes. Don't be a jerk. Pick one. This kind of reaction shows all-encompassing lack of empathy, emotional maturity, deep insecurity, and willingness to do harm. She knew this would hurt OP, but couldn't contain herself. She obviously felt threatened by the existence of this woman and does not have the emotional capacity for empathy or imagination to comprehend that friendships and compassion can last beyond divorce. This girl does not need to get rewarded with an apartment. She needs the reward of therapy. Let's start at the beginning. I'm an only child and had a close relationship with my parents since the dawn of time. I've been picked on a lot when I was younger, and my parents have been quite protective about me due to that fact. When I grew older, I turned into a rebel towards society, but never towards my parents. I told them everything, and when I say everything, I mean everything. They knew everything about my life, friendships, school. I even told them when I experimented with D once. I've never had a serious relationship before I turned 25. I've dated people, but nothing too serious. After my 25th, I've been in 3 serious relationships, my current one included. The previous 2 have ended for different reasons, but there was one common factor in both. It didn't work out between my parents and my ex-partner. Ellie, my first serious relationship, plainly refused to visit my parents for quite some time after a year or 2 into our relationship. She never said why or made a fuss about it. She always said she didn't feel like visiting. This caused tensions between me and Ellie because my parents were upset she never came around. They kind of forced me into strong-arming her to come along from time to time. My second partner, Livy, went on an all-out skirmish with my parents, saying they were constantly meddling in our relationship and the way we run our household. We've been together for about 1.5 years, but started living together after a year. She openly confronted them, and this ended in me siding with my parents and me and Livy breaking up eventually. In both relationships, I was convinced my parents didn't do anything wrong and that my ex was the problem. A few years after Livy, I met Sarah, now my wife. Everything was incredible with her. I was scared she wasn't going to like my parents, so I was very nervous the first time she came around visiting my parents. My parents and her hit it off right away. I was so relieved. Finally, a girl who didn't hate my parents. Sarah even actively sought out companionship with my parents, asking them out on restaurants with us, inviting them to visit our apartment. After a year, I moved in with her, invited them out shopping. Every time we went visiting an open house event, they came along. It was great. I never told Sarah about the problems my parents had in the past with my exes. I tried to manage every social interaction in such a way that nothing bad could happen. This was quite tiresome, but it had effect. Everyone was enjoying their company. We dated for 2 years and were busy with looking for a home. In our country, it's easier financially to buy a home when you are married, due to legislations, etc. So I proposed and she said yes. From here on out, everything started to go south. We decided to do a very small wedding, since it was mostly due to the fact we were buying a house. If it was up to Sarah, it was just me and her, but I convinced her that I wanted to marry with our families present. So we decided on a very small wedding with only my parents, her brother and his girlfriend. My parents came to pick us up to go to City Hall at 1400 hours. They arrived at 1320 and invited themselves in. This was quite annoying since Sarah and I were still in the process of dressing up. Our apartment wasn't that big, and with 4 people in it, dressing up wasn't so easy. This annoyed Sarah a bit, but she didn't make a fuss about it. We went to City Hall, got married, and went to my parents-in-law for a few drinks before we would head out to the restaurant. Since my parents-in-law have a big and beautiful garden, we decided to do a little photo shoot with everyone. We switched cameras so everyone had the chance to take some pictures. Me and Sarah had only one request. No photos on Facebook, please. Since we didn't invite any of our friends, we didn't want to make a big fuss about it. Besides, Sarah and I don't feel very secure with our bodies, so we don't like to have our pictures openly shared on social media. At that time, nobody protested. Once we got in the car to go to the restaurant, I noticed my mother was very silent. I know her quite well, and the way she was acting meant she was bothered with something. When we got out of the car, she finally said what was wrong. She didn't agree with the no Facebook rule. Besides that, she had the feeling that the girlfriend of my brother-in-law didn't give her enough time to take pictures with us. Side note, Katie, the girlfriend from my brother-in-law, Peter, lived in the same town as my parents. She was the niece of my parents' neighbors, people who my parents have been in fights with for over the past 15 years. She was convinced she was out to get her. I tried to reassure her that that was not the case, and re-explained why we didn't want the picture on Facebook. The rest of the day was quite uneventful, besides the fact we enjoyed ourselves. The next morning, I opened Facebook and saw something that pissed me off a lot. My mother had published the pictures of our wedding on her Facebook. I told Sarah, who was annoyed but not mad about it. I called my mother and nicely explained to her that this was not okay, and that we would appreciate if she removed the pictures. After a lot of buts and ifs, she deleted the pictures from Facebook. A few months after this incident, we were moving into our new home. On the day of the move, everyone came around to help. The moment my parents arrived in our new home, they started to pull open drawers and exploring the house. To be honest, it didn't bother me, but I saw Sarah frowning, so I quickly intervened. I tried to distract them from what they were doing by asking them to help in the garden. Fast forward again a few weeks into the future. We moved into our new home and were almost finished with all of the unpacking. There were still some of my boxes in the attic of my parents. These boxes were mostly filled with typical single male stuff, like Marvel gadgets and old clothes as well. Clothes which would not fit me anymore since I gained a lot of weight. I told my parents I would come and collect the boxes on a Sunday. Note, me and Sarah alternated on visiting my and her parents on Sunday. So, in week 1 we would visit her parents, and in week 2 we would visit mine, and so forth. I already told my mother I would probably throw away most of it, since I haven't looked at it for some years. This didn't sit well with her. She became irritated, and told me I shouldn't throw everything away because, in her eyes, it had a lot of sentimental value. I told her that's not the case for me since I haven't thought about the boxes for the last 2 years, and besides, the clothes didn't fit me anymore. She kept throwing arguments my way, why I should keep everything, and even insinuated that it was Sarah who didn't let me keep any of the Marvel toys. I told her that we decided not to keep them, since it didn't fit in our lifestyle as a couple. She dropped the topic after that. On that fateful Sunday, me, Sarah, and my parents went to the attic to pick up the boxes. Once in the attic, my mother started to try and convince Sarah not to throw everything away. I jumped in and said that I would look at the content of the boxes and probably throw 90% of it away. My mother got very mad and started accusing Sarah of belittling me and not allowing me to keep some of the stuff I secretly liked, but didn't have the guts to tell her. This completely ticked me off, and I got very mad at my parents. My mother kept insisting that when I said we decided not to keep the content, I actually was giving out a cry for help, and meant that Sarah was commanding me to throw everything away. Sarah just stood there and said nothing. We picked up the boxes and left. A few hours later, my mother called me to apologize towards myself and Sarah. The day after this incident, Sarah tried to tell me she felt hurt due to what happened. She said she felt that my parents are very meddlesome and that their behavior hurt her a lot. The moment she said that, I kinda lost it. I had flashbacks from my past 2 relationships. I started to defend my parents and told Sarah they didn't mean it that way. This was our first and biggest fight we ever had. At a certain point, she yelled at me that if I kept protecting my parents like this, I would eventually lose her. This exclamation brought me an aha-erlebnis. I started to see what my parents have been doing the past few years and what effect it had on my relationships. I started to see the pattern. It took us quite some time to recover from this fight, but we eventually did. I promised her that I would not allow my parents to interfere again, and that I would always pick her side. Never again would I defend the meddling of my parents. This I promised. A week later, I invited my mother out for a movie and told her just that. I told her that I loved her, and my dad, of course, but that they should not belittle me anymore. I'm a grown man who can take care of his own. I'm married and trying to make a life of my own. I asked her not to meddle anymore with my life or my relationship. She said she understood. Flash forward to December 2019. We decided to do a small housewarming with my parents-in-law, Peter and Katie. Things cooled down a bit between Sarah and my parents, but Sarah was on her guard whenever they were around. My parents arrived first at the party. We intended to do a small tour of the home since we redecorated and painted a lot of the rooms. While I was busy with parents, my parents-in-law and Peter and Katie arrived. I was pouring drinks for my parents in the kitchen, when all of a sudden I saw my mother sprint out of the living room toward the hall, where the rest was still taking off their jackets. I quickly followed cause I noticed something was off. My mother barged into the hallway, saw Katie giving a small gift to Sarah, something for on our toilet. Sarah opened the toilet and put the gift down. While she opened the door, everyone peered inside the toilet cause we repainted it and wanted to see the result. My mother thought they started the tour without waiting on her. She bursted into the hallway saying, "It seems you weren't going to wait on me, so here I am." An awkward silence ensued. On that note, we started the tour. The night went on pretty uneventful, but Sarah was not pleased with my mother's outburst. Flash forward a few weeks later. February 2020. It's a Sunday, and we were at my parents' house. We were having a discussion about carnivals since it's the season that carnivals are being organized. Me and Sarah said we never enjoyed carnivals, and that if it depended on us, we would never encourage our future children to go to a carnival. My mother was quite irritated and asked why not. We once again said we don't like carnivals, and if our future children would not ask about it, we would not encourage it. My mother became more irritated and said, "So I'm not allowed to visit a carnival with my grandchild? I want to visit a carnival with my grandchild." I saw that Sarah was getting angry, so I intervened and told her, politely, that I didn't appreciate the fact she is claiming an unborn, non-existent child, and that this is also a form of meddling, which she wasn't going to do anymore. This remark completely ticked her off. My mother jumped up and started yelling, "So you are not allowing me to see my grandchildren? I can't do anything fun with him or her?" We still stayed calm and repeated that we do not appreciate her remarks. My mother then started her verbal outburst. I knew it. Sarah's mother is going to completely claim my grandchild. She, mother-in-law, is against me from the start. At the party, she was laughing with me due to the fact we hardly see you all, and now we will not see our grandchild. How can you let this happen? Towards me. At this point, Sarah got very mad and upset. We tried to compose ourselves, but we ended up fighting, me and Sarah against my parents. After a while, we decided to go home since my parents didn't understand what we were saying, and they weren't planning on apologizing. This was the last time Sarah saw my parents. What followed were a lot of arguments between me and my parents. Them trying to twist the facts and saying how we misunderstood everything. Them looking for excuses why all these events transpired. In short, it was not their fault. The virus lockdown in our country came as a blessing. We were not allowed to visit anyone. I didn't see my parents for a few months and only heard them on the phone. Meanwhile, tensions rose between Sarah and me. She was happy that I defended us, but she was still very hurt. She said harsh things about my parents, which are correct. On the other hand, was a complete wreck. I was constantly torn between my wife and my parents. My wife, who was completely right about being mistreated by my parents and being hurt. My parents, who raised me, and although I was extremely pissed at them, still were my parents. Long story short, the topic of my parents was to be avoided at all costs. It caused unspoken tension between Sarah and me, cause deep down, I found it very difficult to accept Sarah's anger, although completely justified. It hurt me to hear her talk about my parents in such a way. I went in therapy to deal with this. I started to see that my parents have tried to control me all my life and meddled in every aspect of my life. I saw their flaws and shortcomings, which I never saw before. I saw what my wife had gone through the past few months and how it hurt her. I'm still convinced she never wanted this to happen. Rationally, I understand it all. Rationally, I know that I have to set boundaries, which I never did, and form a different kind of relationship with my parents. I've been working on all those concepts a lot the past few months, hurting me deeply. I never cried as much as I did the past year. December 2020. The last couple of months, I tried twice to talk with my parents about everything what happened. Twice, I tried to convince them they were wrong in what they did. Both times, it ended in a big fight where my dad said they were not going to apologize, because they did nothing wrong. Sarah was overreaching. I've been honest with Sarah about both these conversations with my parents, also hurting her in the process. Anyways, December 2020. All of a sudden, my mother asks me if Sarah and I are coming over for Christmas. I said no. I said I would come over but not Sarah. She reacted quite shocked. She didn't understand why Sarah wouldn't come over after all this time. I told her it was easy. They didn't see what they did wrong and never apologized towards Sarah. And all this time they never did try to reach out to her. They only contacted me. So Sarah wasn't going to come along for Christmas since she didn't have the feeling they respected her. Of course, this all was my fault. They were convinced I told them not to reach out to Sarah cause she needed time. I indeed said this in the first 2 weeks after the last fight. I told them they were trying to manipulate me again with this, cause this would be the first time in my life they would actually do what I told them to do. Anyways, a few arguments later, they said they wanted to contact Sarah to apologize. I said that's fine, but after the holidays. The holidays were the first time I was having time off work, and I didn't want to spend it with arguments. They agreed, disheartedly. January 2021. My mother called Sarah. I told her she could only call Sarah if she intended to apologize for what happened. She did so, sort of. She apologized, but also quickly stated that she is going to a shrink, because she isn't someone who would normally meddle with other people's lives, but she has had a rough few years. True. And this has made her upset, unable to cope with situations correctly. Sarah kind of accepted her apologies, and said this would take time to repair. They both agreed on that. Sarah told me afterwards she didn't feel good about the phone call. She felt that she said, "I'm sorry but," and that it wasn't wholeheartedly. She accepted it, but didn't feel that anything has changed. We decided that I would only visit my parents once a month, and she would join me whenever she felt like it, only staying for 15 minutes or so in the beginning. She hasn't went with me just yet, but I understand. This is my story of the past year. I'm constantly torn between the love for my wife and the loyalty towards my parents. I'm very angry at my parents, and I don't know how to deal with it. I understand my wife and her actions, but on the other hand, I wish she would just let it go. Very selfish of me, I know. I feel so torn and sad about this. Ever since this all transpired, I haven't been fully happy. Not a day goes by I melancholically think about these events. Are there people out there who experience something similar? How are you dealing with this situation? How are you dealing with these constant feelings of being torn? Any advice on how to move on and make sure I put the needs of my wife and me before my parents' needs? Any thoughts about my story? Things I might have missed?